what do you guys know? Yes, this is episode number uno, dos, tres, number 3 of Krocking, Locking, and Dropping with your favorite crocodile or alligator, depending on what that picture you saw and the logo is, with the cowboy hat in the middle of the desert. Is there a crocodile that's actually out in the desert? Well, maybe in Australia. But anyways, this is Kenneth the K-Rock Cline, your host for this podcast, and also co-host of Two Palace on a Pod with Mark T. Robinson, which y'all can listen to on Buzzsprout, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And folks, if you're big fans of that podcast, or if you just started listening in and you want more content, don't worry. We're going to get something out there real soon. Just got a lot of things going on with our daily operational lives, like we're just busy. It's part of life. Everybody is busy these days. But that doesn't mean I don't have time for you guys to talk about things that are going on, things that I wanted to think about and things that I wanted to talk about with y'all regarding episode number 3. And folks, we got some real interesting content. Today I wanted to talk about particularly the NFL draft, which is going to be happening this Thursday as of this podcast. And, obviously last year I was really on my edge, on my I was nervous. I was on my edge of my seat. I was just so tensed up because I, being a Texans fan, really had no idea what was going to happen because there was a lot of drama going on there as well. But this year, I'm kind of feeling a little bit down, feeling a little bit not as excited or nervous or tensed up as I was last year. And I'll get into all the reasons in just a moment. And then I figured it'd be nice to do a top 10 NFL draft moments or NFL draft stories that I have heard about in my time, or at least from all the stuff that I watched in the NFL draft. Some of the craziest moments. Weird, strange, incredible NFL draft stories that I'm sure will get you fans a lot excited for the upcoming NFL draft, regardless of what team you may be fans of. But before we get into that, today I wanted to pay tribute to somebody that I really enjoyed watching growing up as a kid. Today I was getting ready to do a Lamar softball game, doing social media, putting out their highlights, and just covering the team as they were, having their senior day honorees for today's game. And by the way, in case you're wondering, our team ended up winning 5-4. So a walk-off victory by a walk-off hit by one of our seniors for today's game. But as I was getting ready to, put out the social media for the game, I happened to glance on the trending section of Twitter. Well, they call it X, but you guys know that Twitter is now X, and I really think they need to get back to Twitter and not use X or so. But X, formerly known as Twitter, the trending section that you guys all know about. And I was actually looking down there, and I happened to see that Stump the Schwab was trending. And immediately I was like, oh my gosh, Stump the Schwab. I used to love that show growing up as a kid. I'm a huge sports history nerd. And if you guys probably don't know me, I can name every historical fact. Like, for example, if you were to ask me who won the 1936 World Series, I'd tell you it's the New York Yankees. If you were to ask me who won Super Bowl III, I would tell you that's a third grade question. That's the New York Jets. And if you were to tell me who won the 2017 World Series, I demand everybody to go down to Los Angeles, California, and drill it in their heads that they would have lost regardless. That's a beef for another day. But anywho, so I was really reminded of Stump the Schwab and all the show of that show that I watched it, or all the episodes of that show that I watched. And I was really surprised to see it on there. And so I thought, I wonder what's going on. I wonder why people were talking about it now. Well, when I clicked on it, I was given a little bit of some heartbreaking news that Howie Schwab, the man who was like the Schwab, the guy that was the statistical researcher, influencer guy on ESPN back when ESPN was really at its peak, he unfortunately passed away today as of this podcast. So it was really kind of a sad thing because you think back to that show as a kid where Howie Schwab was, to put it in context, if you were to compare it to another game show, it would be like The Chase, where you have three intelligent guys all trying to run and grab as much money as they can from this guy known as the Beast or the Chaser, who's trying to capture them. And by doing so, he was going to answer more questions than them in a certain amount of time and everything. So it was kind of like that in modern times. But yeah, it really made me sad because I used to enjoy watching Howie Schwab do his thing on Stump the Schwab. And that was a show that the late Stuart Scott was hosting on ESPN at that time. And Stuart Scott, of course, was another guy that I really admired and respected. And so Stuart Scott was the host. Howie Schwab was, I guess you call him the Beast or the Chaser or the Schwab, whatever. And the purpose of the show was you had three contestants, all of whom claiming they have sports-minded knowledge that they believe they could stump the Schwab. They go through this elimination process in each round, and whoever the top two advance to the next round, and then the person that won the game above the two contestants would actually get to go against the Schwab in a one-on-one competition where basically you answer these questions, all point tallied, based on the number of points and the difficulty of the question on these categories. And you have to try to get more correct answers or you get 3 strikes. And if you get 3 strikes, you're out or you have to answer more than the Schwab. And the Schwab, for the most part, for I want to say 90% or 95%, he was very successful in winning the game. But there were a few times where he got stumped. And those that got stumped, they're part of legends. And, you know, my high school classmates always used to say that, man, you could stump the Schwab and everything. And I really wish I had that opportunity because, unfortunately, when the show was out, I was like in middle school or in high school around that time, and I never would have had the opportunity to do so. But I really wish I was older so I would have had a good chance, and I think I could have, although, to tell you the truth, the Schwab was really the guy that you had to beat. And he was really good. He knew his stuff. And I have tremendous amount of respect for him and was very interested in all that he knew. And I think that's one of the reasons why I became somewhat of a sports history nerd myself. And I was really happy that I had the opportunity to see him and on TV and really wish I could have had a chance to stump him. Some people still to this day believe I could have stumped him. But anyway, it's a real kind of an emotional day for me, mixed emotions, because Howie Schwab, ESPN's stats guy, the guru, if you call it, he passed away today. So it's really sad. Been seeing all the tweets with tributes to him. It just shows you how much loved he was at ESPN at a time when they were really rocking and rolling. So rest in peace to Howie Schwab. I definitely, would have loved to have had a chance to go up against you. I'm sure you're probably going to have a lot of sports figures and a lot of people that are going to test your mind up there, and I'm pretty sure you're convinced that you can win a lot of those matchups up there, wherever you may be. Anyway, that is my tribute to Howie Schwab. Now, folks, we are about moments away from talking about my first topic that I wanted to talk about. But before that, let's go to our random question generator. And we are about to ask myself a question so that way you guys get to know me as a human being. And today's question is, what's on your bucket list for this year? Ooh, man, I've never really been good with bucket lists. So I really want to go on a vacation somewhere. I want to do some kind of family vacation with my family, whether it be in the summertime or I actually do want to do something maybe around the Christmas holidays because usually Christmas I'm always with the family at our house get together. I'm single. I'm not married. I don't have kids yet, even though I'm 33, which is a little embarrassing to say. But we always get together with the family every single year. I do want to do something a little different this year if I could, even if it's during the summertime, because usually we'll have a family reunion with some of our family members out in West Texas, in Alpine to be exact, although I hadn't gone to the last few years because of my job and everything. So I do want to go on a vacation somewhere really amazing and interesting, and hopefully I get that opportunity. I'll have to talk to my parents about that. They might have something going on, but that's something that could happen this year, or maybe not this year, maybe next year, but we'll wait and see. All right, folks, that's going to conclude the first segment. In a few moments, we're going to be talking about my issues with this upcoming NFL draft pertaining to the Houston Texans, and then we'll have our top 10 segment later on. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Folks, we are back, and it's time for the first segment of this show. And today I want to talk about the NFL draft because it is happening this Thursday as we speak. It's going to be from April 25th to the 27th. It'll be taking place in Detroit, Michigan this time, home of the Detroit Lions. And I tell you what, if you're a Detroit Lions fan, you should be excited and happy to have the NFL draft right in your neck of the woods after the season that y'all had as well. Last year, of course, it was in Kansas City, which was good because the Kansas City Chiefs were coming off their second Super Bowl victory, and we're excited to have their third Super Bowl win, which they got this past season. So, yeah, the NFL draft, it's happening this Thursday. It's a 3-day event where all 32 NFL teams get to add new pieces to their rosters to see which teams will be able to elevate themselves to greater glory. Before I get to talking about my Houston Texans and the situation that they find themselves in, let me give out a few thoughts on the teams that I'm really interested to see. A couple of teams that I feel like that deserve to be talked about as far as who they're going to take and what they really need to do. The first team I want to mention real fast are the Chicago Bears. Now, obviously, there had been a lot of discussion as to whether or not the Chicago Bears were going to take Caleb Williams for much of last season, considering the fact that they had already had a quarterback in Justin Fields, who, although had some, I don't want to say great moments, but he was kind of decent at best, unless you were referring to the average scale, which is not necessarily right up there. But there were some questions as to whether or not the Bears were going to take Caleb Williams because they thought that maybe Justin Fields hadn't really proven himself and was deserving of another shot for this upcoming season. But after a while, the Chicago Bears decided, you know what, we're actually going to take a quarterback. We're going to try to draft a quarterback as well. So in order to do that, we're going to trade Justin Fields to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And as of right now, Fields is a backup quarterback to Russell Wilson down in Pittsburgh. But I'm not sure how long that's going to be because Russell Wilson, even though he's had more experience, he's been in some big games, hasn't really played up to the level that he started off through his career. So anyway, that is one team. I think the Chicago Bears are going to take Caleb Williams with the number 1 pick in the upcoming NFL draft. So that is definitely something for Bears fans to be excited about, to get their future quarterback as well. Now, as far as another team that I'm interested in, they're the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings are a team that also needs a quarterback, but they are currently in the number 11 spot, which for this year's NFL draft, you have to think that the top 3 players going into the NFL draft are Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, and Drake May. All 3 of those guys are quarterbacks, and I think Chicago, Washington, and New England will take those 3 in particular order unless something comes up in a surprising way. But the question is, Minnesota, they just traded Kirk Cousins, Kirk Cousins signed a free agent deal to the Atlanta Falcons, and now Minnesota needs a quarterback. And one name that has been popping up lately is J.J. McCarthy from the national champion Michigan Wolverines, who does seem to be the 4th quarterback that could potentially be taken off the board. Now, another guy that is of interest is Washington's Michael Penix Jr., who was a Heisman Trophy finalist, lost to Jaden Daniels, led Washington to the national championship game, but lost to McCarthy in the national championship game, or McCarthy in the national championship game. And so that is going to be a question that I wonder how much Minnesota will trade up to get to at least the top 5 in hopes of taking their quarterback in J.J. McCarthy or somebody else as well. But then, of course, you have to wonder, what about the other quarterbacks? Are any of them going to be going in the first or second round. We know that Spencer Rattler, a guy that had declared for the NFL draft, is probably going to be a day 2 selection, so his second rounder or third rounder. I know that there have been some teams that have interest in him. One of those happens to be the Texans, and the more I think about it, the more I think it actually makes sense, because Spencer Rattler would be drafted by the Texans to serve as C.J. Stroud's backup. And the reason why I just found this out is that both Case Keenum and Davis Mills are on their last years of their Texans contracts, and both of them are expected to be free agents. So you want to kind of keep the Texans quarterback room in position to where if something were to happen to Stroud, you want to have some guys that are very capable of doing the job. Now, I'm not saying that Spencer Rattler will be the franchise quarterback. I just think, for somebody like him who wants to have a career in the NFL after going through all the trials and tribulations in his collegiate career, whether it was in high school or whether it was at Oklahoma and then South Carolina, you have to think that the reason why any team would want to draft Spencer Rattler would be to serve as a backup. So that way, that would get him some confidence to hopefully put together a career that he would certainly like to have in the NFL. Now, so that's going to be something to keep an eye on and watch. And then a guy that I want to see go in the first round, Marvin Harrison Jr. He was listed to go with Arizona, and that to me makes sense because the Cardinals have yet to get rid of Kyler Murray, and they're still relying on him as well. So I would think that you need to have a primary wide receiver if you're the Arizona Cardinals, and a guy that could certainly be a good, capable player for you would be Marvin Harrison Jr., the son of Marvin Harrison, who also played his collegiate football at Ohio State, or the Ohio State, I should say, as C.J. Stroud's top wide receiver. So definitely Marvin Harrison, a guy that I could see going to Arizona at number 4. So those are my few teams that I'm interested in as well. And that brings me back to the Houston Texans. Now, I got to be real honest with you. I struggle when a team doesn't have a first-round selection because, in my personal opinion, from what I've seen in previous NFL drafts, the first round is usually the ones that are the most exciting because they're the ones that get a lot of coverage. Because whenever there's a massive trade that happens, that's usually the stuff that is really the biggest highlight. And then, of course, there's always going to be some big-time selections as far as who's going to be the number 1 pick in the NFL draft, or is this guy going to go to this team? What's wrong with that player? Why is he sliding down and this and that? The first round, to me, builds storylines because you have all these incredible gifted players that are nationally known, and then there may be a few that slide into the second round or third round, depending on where they go as well. But this is really where I feel like the first round gets a lot of exciting and a lot of draw. And last year, as a Texans fan, I knew there was going to be a lot of drama and a lot of suspense because while the Carolina Panthers had the number 1 pick after trading with the Chicago Bears, it became apparent that the Panthers were going to draft Bryce Young out of Alabama. So that left the Texans with a bit of an issue here. The Texans had 2 first-round picks last year. They had the number 2 pick, albeit they probably should have had the number 1 pick considering that they lost the last game of the regular season to the Indianapolis Colts. And then they had the number 12 pick, which was another draft pick that they got from Cleveland, I believe, in a couple of years ago in the Deshaun Watson deal. So you have to think that the Texans were going to have to play it smart at some point to try to figure out what they were going to do. Because Houston was in a very peculiar situation. There were some people that were questioning, should the Texans take a quarterback? And if so, if it wasn't going to be Bryce Young, was it going to be C.J. Stroud? Was it going to be Will Levis? Or was it going to be Anthony Richardson? There was just a lot of drama with what the Texans were going to do with the number 2 pick. But then on the other side of the equation, the Texans also needed some help with their defense. And a couple of guys that stood out defensively, one, of course, being Will Anderson Jr. out of the University of Alabama. The other, of course, being Jalen Carter from the University of Georgia, who had just won their second consecutive national championship. So a big dominant defensive force there. I mean, the Texans could have gone either way, but the biggest problem that they were facing was you had Arizona, who had the number 3 pick in last year's NFL draft, which is kind of ironic. Well, not quite ironic this year, but Arizona had the number 3 pick in last year's NFL draft. But they didn't really need a quarterback. They didn't really need a bit of a defensive presence. They were trying so hard to figure out a way to protect Kyler Murray, but yet they all knew that it was probably going to be two quarterbacks plus maybe Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, depending on who you ask. And the player that they ended up selecting, an offensive lineman, would have not been a good third pick overall selection because he would have probably made more money, and yet I don't know if he would have produced with the amount of salary that he would have had he been selected in the third round or third pick overall in the draft. So the Arizona Cardinals were a team that you figured was going to be trading. Well, there was going to be a lot of activity, a lot of action, as far as a lot of teams that were going to be paying a lofty price to move up to the number 3 to get the quarterback if it hadn't been C.J. Stroud taken at number 2 overall. And you had to think that if the Texans were trying to figure out a way to get themselves a franchise quarterback, they could have easily taken a defensive player in the first round, and they probably could have, waited until the second round or with their second selection unless they decided to move up to get the last quarterback remaining. But the problem I felt like with that was if you were going to do that, you are risking losing one or the other. It's almost like you have two outstanding flavors of ice cream and you love them both. It's you and somebody else. You have to choose either a Reese's peanut butter flavor ice cream or red velvet cake ice cream. I'm just using those as examples, folks. You love both those flavors, but you know that you have to pick one because eventually the other person's going to get the one left. And so you had to kind of figure out some sort of way to satisfy yourself, even though you were going to lose that interest in a flavor of ice cream. And in this particular case, the Texans were in the situation where they could draft a defensive player at number 2, but they lose a top quarterback with their second selection because there was no way that the Texans were going to trade or make a big trade to draft number 3 to draft a quarterback at that spot. So the Texans were in a bit of a bind because fans wanted a quarterback. You had head coach D'Amico Ryans who wanted a linebacker, a defensive player, and Nick Caserio obviously wanting to get this draft right. So you're sitting there thinking, what's going to happen? Are the Texans going to take a quarterback? Or are they going to take a linebacker? I mean, what are they going to do? Like, everybody was on edge. The Texans were the team of the talk of the NFL draft because everybody knew Carolina was going to draft Bryce Young. That was a foregone conclusion. It was the Texans that had all the cards in the NFL draft. What they were going to do would decide the outcome of last year's NFL draft, in a way. Because if the Texans had drafted a linebacker, there were going to be a bunch of teams trying to trade with Arizona for the number 3 pick to get the quarterback, ideally C.J. Stroud. Or if the Texans took C.J. Stroud, there would be a reduction of teams that would back off from trading into the number 3 spot, which would have left fewer interests for trading to that number 3 because the Texans already got arguably the first or second best quarterback in the NFL draft with the number 2 spot at C.J. Stroud. So there was a lot of question as to what the Texans were going to do. And I'm listening and I'm trying to figure out what's going to happen. I'm getting these Twitter updates, and all of a sudden, here comes the second pick in the NFL draft. So I'm waiting nervously. I didn't know what the Texans were going to do. Were they going to take C.J. Stroud? Were they going to take Will Anderson at number 2? I mean, who were they going to take, They could have taken another quarterback. And now I get a notification that said the Houston Texans are selecting C.J. Stroud. And at that moment, you were just so relieved because even though defense was the top priority, I didn't have complete trust in Davis Mills to be the franchise guy, and we needed somebody to have that spark and that impact. And C.J. Stroud, in my mind, produces that. Now, there were a couple of question marks with C.J. Stroud, most notably with the S2 test, which he didn't really do too well. And to be honest, it's a test that, I understand why, but the way they hyped up that test, it was like the most important test in all of the National Football League. I still have no idea what that test entails, but I don't really think it should be the most important test that you take if you're an NFL draft. It's important, but not the most important. I think it just depends on whether or not you have a great career on the football field. And that's what C.J. Stroud had with a great answer. So the Texans take C.J. Stroud, and now Arizona's number 3, although you would think that Arizona was going to be trading up. And I'm sitting there relieved thinking, man, we got C.J. Stroud. I'm really excited. Glad we got a quarterback. Let's see what happens now. And then all of a sudden I get another tweet. The Houston Texans are trading with the Arizona Cardinals for the number 3 spot. And you're just like, what? That's when everything erupted. If you were in Houston at the draft party, you had to be surprised and shocked. If you were at the NFL draft in Kansas City, you had to be stunned and surprised. Because while Kansas City, the Chiefs being there for their Super Bowl, mocking us to say, hey, we're the champs and let's see what you guys have to try to stop it to us, that might have been the highlight of your day. But the Texans trading up for the number 3 spot after drafting C.J. Stroud with their first pick, it was really the highlight of that draft. At that moment, you knew right then and there that this was for real. The Texans were going to be they were going to be a legitimate threat, even though there were still going to be some question marks about their season. And you expected them to improve, but they were going to be the highlight of that NFL draft, no matter what happened the rest of the way. And sure enough, the Houston Texans drafted Will Anderson Jr., number 3. And to this point, and I know it's still early, this has to be the greatest draft moment in the history of the Houston Texans franchise. We drafted 2 future Hall of Famers, or I should say we drafted 1 Hall of Famer in Andre Johnson, and we drafted a future Hall of Famer in J.J. Watt. We had a questionable draft of Mario Williams back in 2006 when we selected him number 1 overall instead of Reggie Bush or Vince Young. And we also drafted D'Amico Ryans in the 2nd round, who's our head coach at this point. But you cannot tell me that last year's NFL draft with the Texans was the best draft in the history. The fact that you took your franchise quarterback with number 2 so that way you could reduce the amount of interest in a number 3 pick, then trade up a boatload for the number 3 pick to get your best defensive guy. At some point in these draft meetings for the Texans, when they're debating about who's really going to be more beneficial between C.J. Stroud and Will Anderson, somebody, I don't know whether he was really just bored or frustrated or tired or maybe just trying to make a name for himself, just said, hey, why don't we just get both? I mean, odds are this kind of move doesn't always pan out well, but after 1 year, it's safe to say that this move has panned out well for the Texans because you not only drafted the offensive rookie of the year, but you also drafted the defensive rookie of the year. And I want to say that there were 4 times in history that the offensive and defensive rookie of the years were both on the same team. And that had a lot of Texans fans very excited, and especially with the season they had afterwards, winning the division, winning a playoff game, getting to the divisional round. I know they got beat badly by Baltimore, but it was like it was just a great season, and there's a lot of excitement. But not only that, the Texans also added other key players. They added offensive center Juice Scruggs, wide receiver Tank Dow, who seems to be a top-notch receiver, along with Nico Collins and another receiver for the Texans, which I'll get to in a little bit. You have to think that if you're the Houston Texans, this is a very exciting thing for the franchise and for the future. But that being said, the Houston Texans, as of right now, do not have a draft pick in the first round. The first time they will draft a player this year will be in the 42nd pick, which will be the 10th pick in this upcoming NFL draft. Now, I never like it when a team doesn't have a first-round pick because sometimes I think it's beneficial to add those kind of pick in the first round to get a player of an impact. Although I know it's not always guaranteed that player will be a success. There are always going to be hits. There are always going to be misses, so you don't really know which way it's going to go. But the feeling of not having a first-round pick kind of worries me a bit. However, the more I think about this, in some ways the Texans did draft a player because they traded their first-round pick, or one of their first-round picks, with the Minnesota Vikings to get out of that pick. So they got Minnesota's pick, and they asked Minnesota to move up. And as a result, the Texans used that leverage to make that trade with Buffalo for Stephon Diggs. And you have to think that as big and impactful as it is, that was your first-round selection, even though Stephon Diggs has already had an established name in the NFL. Because, I mean, with the Texans, there are more exciting things going on. The Texans won the offseason. You know, I know Nick Caserio and the coaching staff and the players don't want to say it that they won the offseason. They don't want to take any praise and everything. And look, I would feel the same way. I'd be weary of it as well. But they won the offseason. When you trade for Stephon Diggs, you add Joe Mixon, running back for the Cincinnati Bengals, and you add Danielle Hunter from the Minnesota Vikings to your defense. You look at all these elements coming into play. This is a Texans team that could be a legitimate threat to win the AFC South or AFC Championship. And I'm not picking them to win at this point because Kansas City's still there, Cincinnati's a threat, Baltimore as well. But you have to think the Texans are a threat at best. So where does that leave me as far as Thursday night for the first round of the NFL draft? Well, the only way that this NFL draft will be exciting for me, for the Texans' perspective, is if Nick Caserio decides to trade back into the first round to get their guy. But in all honesty, it's really hard to say because I feel like that's going to cost a lot. Now, I know the draft chart might not say it as much, but I feel like the Texans are risking it if they were to draft 10 or more spots just to be near the tail end of the first round. I mean, it would be surprising if they did, although, to be fair, I don't think Nick Caserio is the kind of person that would say, well, we're just going to keep our distance. We're going to make some trades here and there. There's going to be trades. The Texans are going to be a team that's going to trade at some point. They have 9 picks this year, none in the first round, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did trade in the first round, although I would advise against it because I feel like you would be wasting some of your assets for the future if you want to keep this team in contention to win a championship, hopefully bring a Super Bowl to Houston. But the scariest part for me is the fact that the last time the Texans didn't have a first-round pick was back in 2020, and that was because Bill O'Brien, the head coach of the Texans, had decided that it was either 2020 or 2021. I think it was 2021, because the Texans had used up their first-round picks when they traded for Laramie Tunsil, which, you know, as big of a trade as that was, it really was so costly to get him. Costing up the first-round pick. And Bill O'Brien wasn't really the smartest of GMs. Let's just be real clear here. Nick Caserio tops him all the way. So the Texans didn't have a first-round pick. They didn't even have a second-round pick in 2021. But now they're in a situation where they don't have a first-round pick, and you don't have to wait until 10 picks into the second round, barring, of course, a big trade that happens. So there's obviously going to be some trades. The Texans will trade at some point in the NFL draft. It's just not going to be as exciting and fun if it doesn't happen in the first round. And I'm not expecting it to, although I wouldn't be surprised if it did. But you have to wait on day 2 and 3, which a lot of players did not get the coverage. They might have been recognized at some point as big players. And then you're going to have guys that you don't know who you're picking and everything. But that's the thing. There's always going to be hidden gems in the NFL draft, and maybe the Texans are hoping to get some hidden gems in the NFL draft. You know, Tom Brady, hidden gem, 6th round. Shannon Sharp, hidden gem, 6th round. Same thing with Terrell Davis, 6th round pick. I'm trying to think if there was any players picked in the first or the 2nd through 5th rounds that were huge impacts. Jack Lambert was a 2nd round pick, Hall of Fame for the Steelers. John Stallworth, 4th round pick for the Steelers in that same draft. You know, Pittsburgh drafted 4 Hall of Famers in that 74 draft, and they also added a free agent undrafted free agent who became a fifth Hall of Famer. So the Steelers were a perfect 5 for 5 as far as Hall of Fame players were concerned. Bottom line is this Thursday should really be interesting, but it's definitely going to be Friday and Saturday when things are going to heat up for the Texans. And I think the fans are more excited for the uniforms that the Texans are going to get than the draft picks as well. But I'm not saying that the draft picks the Texans will get won't be of impact to the team, because we saw what Tank Dell has done with the Texans, even though he got hurt to end the season. We know what Will Anderson Jr. and C.J. Stroud have done, obviously. I just think the Texans are in a very unique situation, given the fact that as of right now, they're the big threats to win. They're one of the hunted teams, although they're still hunting to be the top team. They want to knock off Kansas City. They want to knock off Cincinnati. They want to knock off Baltimore or Buffalo. And then, of course, get to the NFC. You want to take on the NFC's best in the Super Bowl. The Texans do have a tough first-place schedule, but that was to be expected after they won the division. It's just now a question of whether or not all these picks and all these players that come together can live up to the expectations and to the hype that has been bestowed upon them from the national media, as well as everyone that feels that the Chiefs dynasty, as great as it is, could be in some serious trouble as of right now. We know the Chiefs can respond, but if I were the Texans and if I were everybody else, I think the Texans could be a legitimate threat. But we'll see what happens this Thursday with the upcoming NFL draft. And we're going to step aside for a moment, but when we come back, I'm going to talk about some top 10 epic NFL draft moments that I can recall in my time. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. Everybody, it is time for our second segment, and as I said earlier, folks, I am a sports history nut, if you will, sports history wizard, or I don't know, genius. Well, I wouldn't say genius, because I'd be going along the lines of being arrogant, and I don't try to be arrogant as well. But as I said, I am a bit of a sports history wizard. Well, let's just move right along. And I talked a little bit about my sports history knowledge and also how the NFL draft and how I'm somewhat a little less excited about this year's NFL draft for the Texans than I was last year, or, as far as the drama and all that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I get psyched up for the NFL draft, because every year there's always going to be about one or two, maybe three moments which will define the year's NFL draft for years to come, even if it doesn't happen automatically right away. And folks, I decided what better way to make this interesting by coming up with a top 10 memorable NFL draft moments or crazy stories that I have heard about in the NFL draft. Now, some of these are moments that I wasn't around for, but then there are other moments that happened where I was around for. So I figured, what better way to make this interesting than to come up with a top 10. Now, if you follow my other podcast, Two Pals on a Pod, me and my co-host, Mark T. Robinson, we usually do a top 5, or Block 5 top 5, as he likes to call it, where we just kind of count down our top 5 sports moments or favorite movies or, different types of food or just different categories that go along those lines. So I figured, well, I might as well just go ahead and try to talk about something really, 10 crazy NFL draft moments from everything that I heard about or read about, historically speaking. And folks, this is definitely something that I'm really interested in talking about, and hopefully you guys get a pickup as well, because as we all know, this NFL draft is on this Thursday, and we are very excited to see which NFL teams are going to get the players that they're going to receive. With that being said, let's get right to it. Our top 10, or my top 10 NFL draft moments that I have heard about in my lifetime, or not in my lifetime, but just something that I read about it. So let's get started. So, starting off with number 10, and what better way to start this countdown than by referring to the team that has a history of terrible draft picks. That's right, it's the New York Jets, Jets. Yep, the New York Jets, who have their fair share of historical draft moments that either get them excited or they don't like it, and years from now, they either are right or they're either wrong. And I just feel sorry for Jets fans because they have really been so suffering as of lately. As a matter of fact, the more I think about it, the Jets, any team that has a ETS or it's a single word, a word with an ETS at the end, they're not that good in a sense. The New York Mets, the Brooklyn Nets, the New York Jets, I mean, come on. You guys got to come up with some better team names as well. That's why you're kind of struggling in your second tier to all the NBA, NHL, and NFL teams as well, or in the MLB as well. So, that being said, let's get right to it. Here are the top 10 moments. So, we start off with the New York Jets. And, you know, Jets fans, back in the days when New York hosted the NFL draft, nowadays it's in different cities around the country, but New York was the host of the NFL draft at Radio City Music Hall. And every year, Jets fans would come into it, and whenever their team was on the clock, they would get so excited, hoping that they would get their player. And depending on who the player was that they selected, their reaction was either one of two things: cheers with excitement or boos and anger, depending on who it is. Well, that was made evident in 1995 when the New York Jets had an opportunity to draft Warren Sapp, a defensive tackle for the University of Miami. Now, Warren Sapp was supposed to be one of the top picks in that year's NFL draft. However, there had been some rumors about him using drugs or something, about a failed drug test and everything, and that hadn't really been proven from what I was told or understood. But you know how rumors work. If there's somebody that they feel might have been involved in this, they tend to stay away. So Warren Sapp, unfortunately, was one of the players that slid down a bit. And as he was sliding down, the New York Jets appeared on the clock. And I don't really remember. I think they might have had the 10th pick in that year's NFL draft. Well, either way, when the Jets fans got wind that they were very excited about the possibility of having Warren Sapp drop right to them, and when it was their turn to pick, everybody was like, Jets, come on, bring Warren Sapp on. You know, like they wanted him on their team. They wanted him on their squad. They wanted him to join them, and they said, they'll take care of it, no worry. And sure enough, the NFL commissioner, Paul Tagliabue, comes up. Warren Sapp's about to be announced. Jets fans are so excited. But then, in a surprising twist, the New York Jets select tight end Kyle Brady. And that left Jets fans so furious and frustrated because they technically already had another tight end or a few tight ends. So everyone was so confused and wondered what was going on. And the Jets fans were so upset. Give away my season tickets, or the Jets are going to have 6 tight ends next year. Rich Kotite can't do anything with that offense. And of course, oh man, it was so bad for Jets fans. They had their hopes up that they were going to get Warren Sapp, and then all of a sudden they had the rug pulled out from underneath them. Well, as it turns out, Kyle Brady, you know, he had an okay career with the Jets, but that never worked out. As for Warren Sapp, he goes to Tampa. He puts together a Hall of Fame career, and the rest, as they say, is history. A Super Bowl champion with Tampa Bay, but the New York Jets, they had a lot of misses, and that one, in my opinion, was certainly the biggest miss. So that was the pick in 1995. Now, we move on to number 9, and we're going to go up to 3 years later, in 1998. Now, this was the NFL draft in which Peyton Manning and Ryan Leaf were drafted number 1 and number 2 overall. And Peyton Manning, of course, went to the Colts at number 1, and as we all know, Hall of Fame career, 2 Super Bowls, one of the best to ever do it, and a guy that's currently the star of many commercials and opportunities that he can get for possibly a future hosting gig. Whereas Ryan Leaf, unfortunately, ends up being arguably the biggest bust in NFL history. He goes to the San Diego Chargers, wins a couple of games, and then from that point on, it just didn't quite work out for him. It just all went downhill after a terrible performance in the third game of the season for the Chargers. Then, of course, he had that infamous meltdown as well. So you started the 98 NFL draft with the best quarterback possibly taken in the 1990s, and then the worst quarterback taken in the 1990s, the top 2 picks. What you probably forget was that Randy Moss was also in that NFL draft class, and he slid. And I'm not talking about sliding all the way to the end of the draft or into the second round. Now, I'm talking about he slid a long way. And he was expected to be a top 5 player, but because of some off-field issues that he had in the past, NFL teams were a little bit wary to back up on him. And so no one really knew where Randy Moss was going to go, except there was one coach that believed he had the answer. That was Dennis Green, the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings at the time. Well, the problem was the Minnesota Vikings had the number 21 pick overall. And you're thinking, well, maybe Minnesota should trade up to get closer. Well, they didn't want to do that because they wanted to keep their assets in hand. So Dennis Green, the day before the draft or so, he called Randy Moss and said, hey, man, you're going to go be with Minnesota Vikings. We're going to pick you at 21. No, coach, says Randy. No, I'm going to go to this team or I'm going to go to that team. And Dennis Green's like, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. You're going to come right to us and everything. So Dennis Green actually predicted that Randy Moss was going to be a Minnesota Viking at pick number 21. And just to prove that, he called Chris Carter, a Hall of Fame wide receiver for the Vikings, and told him what he thought. Chris Carter thought he was crazy. There was no way that Randy Moss was going to be there at number 21. He was going to get picked up somewhere. Moss wasn't taken in the first 10 picks as in a bit of a surprise, even though he wasn't going to go number 1. So he wasn't in the top 10. The 11th pick belonged to the Dallas Cowboys. And at the time, the Cowboys were on the decline. They still had Troy Aikman, who was about a couple years away from retirement. They still had Michael Irvin, who was a year or so away from having his career come to a sudden end. And then they had Emmitt Smith, who was only a few years away from being a Cowboy and then having one miserable, forgettable season in Arizona. And you're thinking to yourself, Randy Moss being drafted to the Cowboys, where he plays alongside Michael Irvin, and Irvin and Moss, that's a dynamic wide receiver duel right there, even though Irvin was getting up there in years, whereas Randy Moss was a rookie. It's almost like you're drafting a predecessor. So this would be a perfect opportunity for Dallas to draft Randy Moss with their number 11th pick overall. And perfect time for him to go to America's team. And wait just a second. I've been told that the Dallas Cowboys passed up on Randy Moss and they drafted somebody else? Wow. Of all the draft misses the Dallas Cowboys have had, this one takes the cake. The Cowboys don't draft Randy Moss, and unfortunately, Randy Moss continues to slide all the way until pick number 21, where, you guessed it, the Minnesota Vikings drafted him. And that's what would lead Randy Moss to have arguably the greatest rookie season in the history of the NFL. 69 receptions for 1,313 yards, 17 touchdown passes. This included a Thanksgiving Day game in which Randy Moss caught 4 passes, or I think he actually caught 3 passes for 3 touchdowns and 100 and something yards against the Dallas Cowboys, the team that didn't draft him. Moss would go on to win Rookie of the Year honors in the NFL and would go on to be one of the greatest wide receivers in the history of the NFL. And if you're a Dallas fan, you have to be kicking yourself because you could have maybe won a Super Bowl with the guy. Even if Michael Irvin retires, you still got Randy Moss. Even if Troy Aikman retires, you still got Randy Moss. Even if Emmitt Smith leaves, you still got Randy Moss. Of course, you would need to find another quarterback to throw him the football, but come on, Dallas. This was your opportunity. You want to be America's team? Strike gold. Do something. Don't just go all in. Say you're going to go all in and do nothing. Kind of a foreshadowing there, if you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, that's my number 9 draft moment. So, at number 8, this is one of the craziest moments that I have ever heard about in the NFL draft. This involves the Minnesota Vikings, who have a history of passing up teams, or passing up their picks in the amount of time. Now, normally in the NFL draft, you're allowed a certain amount of time, depending on the round. I think it's 15 minutes in the first round, Then it drops down to 10 minutes or so. All you have to do is, in that time, you have to get a card up there. Then they hand it off to somebody, and then they give it to the commissioner, and then the commissioner announces your pick. Well, the rule is you have to get it in by 15 minutes, or else someone else is going to take your spot, and they're going to make the pick. Now, you can still give your card even after the NFL, after your 15 minutes, but as long as you have your pick, you can't let other teams take advantage of the opportunity. So Minnesota, unfortunately, has a habit of doing this in previous years. They did it in 2003, where they let time wind out, and they let two teams pass them to take their players. But fortunately for them, they got Kevin Williams out of that. However, one of the stories that I heard was in 1985 when the Vikings were trying to get offensive tackle Bill Fralick from the University of Pittsburgh, and Bill Fralick just said, "No, I don't want to play for you. You guys are cheap. It's cold in Minnesota. I want to play in warm weather. And I'll tell you what, if you guys draft me, I'm not going to do it, because I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go into professional wrestling. We have a WrestleMania stuff. I'm going to be in that. I'm going to do the Royal Rumble. If you guys draft me with the number 2 pick in 1985, guess what? I'm not coming. Sorry, pal. That's not going to happen." Well, I don't know if that was exactly how the conversation went, but it went somewhere along those lines. So Bill Fralick did not want to play in Minnesota because the Vikings at the time were cheap, and he wanted to get out of cold weather, and he wanted to go to Atlanta because he wanted to experience what warm weather was like. So the Minnesota Vikings had the number 2 pick, and they were up on the clock, but they did something surprising. They passed on their pick, which stunned everybody. So that meant that the Houston Oilers, who were the number 3 pick at the time, would be up on the clock. And the Minnesota Vikings, while doing this, were actually trying to trade the pick to the Atlanta Falcons. And so the Atlanta Falcons got a couple of things from the Vikings as well, and they moved up to number 2. And the Atlanta Falcons did, in fact, take Bill Fralick, who went to the Falcons as a number 2 pick. The Houston Oilers were next, and with their 3rd selection, they took Texas A&M linebacker Ray Childress, who had a pretty good career with the NFL and the Oilers. And certainly, if I last remembered, he owned a car dealership in Houston. I used to remember seeing him in all the commercials for the car dealership. I forget what it was called at the moment. But Ray Childress was taken number 3. And then the Minnesota Vikings had the 4th pick. And the Vikings ended up getting the last laugh out of this because they selected Chris Dolman, who was Bill Fralick's teammate in Pittsburgh. And Chris Dolman, of course, would go on to have a Hall of Fame career, whereas Bill Fralick, not quite the same results. I know he passed away a couple years ago, and rest in peace to him. But I will say, though, that Bill Fralick did, in fact, get in the wrestling ring when he took part in the Royal Rumble. So that was a kind of a crazy situation there for the Minnesota Vikings, who have a history of not giving their picks in time, but yet for some reason they seem to get the better end of the deal. Getting 3 qualified players, and one of them happening to go into Hall of Fame. So that's a really remarkable thing. Okay, so number 7, and this is something that I was thinking about. I think I talked a little bit about this in my first segment, but this was when the Houston Texans had the number 1 pick in 2006. And that year, you were coming off the greatest college football game with Texas and USC in the Rose Bowl, which had 3 stars, Vince Young, Reggie Bush, and Matt Leinart. And those 3 guys were the top 3 picks, or supposed to be the top 3 picks in the National Football League. But you think back to that particular moment, the Texans were in a bit of a bizarre situation because many fans wanted them to get Vince Young because he was a hometown hero and everything, but the general manager, Charlie Connolly, believed that Vince Young wasn't the kind of guy, wasn't the kind of quarterback that would have fit the Texans' offense at the time. But then he was decided between Reggie Bush and Mario Williams, who was a defensive end for North Carolina State. And Charlie Connolly surprised everyone when it was announced that he was going to draft Mario Williams number 1 overall instead of Reggie Bush, which surprised everybody. Why would you not take the best player available in the draft? And this was the Texans' second opportunity to have the first pick overall. The first time was when they drafted David Carr, which looking back I think was a terrible mistake because you don't want to have a rookie quarterback get drafted for an expansion franchise. So that was a huge mistake. on that part. But in 2006, they drafted Mario Williams over Reggie Bush. And the reason why I come to find out was because Reggie Bush was a great running back, but he didn't have the appearance of a guy that would give you an every play kind of a running back. He was a guy, the question was, would he be able to withstand the hits and everything as he was getting the ball? Whereas, was he going to be a different type of, running back? That wasn't the kind of vision for what Charlie Connolly had. Not Charlie Connery, Charlie Casserly. I apologize to Charlie Casserly thinking about his name. But Charlie Casserly decided to pick Mario Williams because he felt that the defense needed help and improvement. And some years later, it turned out that Mario Williams actually had a somewhat of a better career than both Reggie Bush and Vince Young, even though Reggie Bush wound up winning the Super Bowl and Vince Young was named the Offensive Rookie of the Year. But Casserly also redeemed himself when, with his first pick in the second round, he chose D'Amico Ryans, now the current Texans head coach, and Ryans would end up winning Defensive Rookie of the Year that year. So, in some ways, it kind of balanced each other out. And I think what that tells you is that sometimes the best player available isn't the proper fit for an NFL team. And I think for the Texans, they kind of figured that the easy way or the hard way. Whereas the New Orleans Saints drafted Reggie Bush, and Bush was good, but again, not quite the level of expectations for him. And Vince Young, he started off well in his rookie season, but again, it just didn't quite have that same level. He just never could overcome that peak of that epic game in the Rose Bowl. So that's number 7, the drafting of Mario Williams over Reggie Bush by the Houston Texans. Number 6. This is so recent. This was a few years ago, back in 2017, when the Chicago Bears had the number 2 pick overall, or actually they traded up to the number 2 selection with the intention of drafting a quarterback. And they had 2 options. They had either Patrick Mahomes of Texas Tech, great quarterback, but didn't quite get the hype around him like some of the other quarterbacks in the draft, or Deshaun Watson of Clemson, coming off a national championship performance, and who Dabo Swinney believed that drafting Deshaun Watson would be like drafting Michael Jordan in the NFL draft. Well, the Chicago Bears decided, instead of taking those 2, they're going to draft Mitchell Trubisky, quarterback from the University of North Carolina. And you kind of think that, okay, that was a little bit suspicious at best, because Trubisky wasn't really expected to be the number 1 quarterback taken out of the draft. It was mostly either Deshaun Watson, and you had to think that maybe Trubisky would have been at least the number 2 or the number 3 quarterback taken in the draft when you look back in hindsight. But Bears fans were like, okay, we got a quarterback. Hey, it's okay. We got the best one out there. But as we've come to find out, Kansas City traded up to the number 10 spot. I think they moved up 17 spots from 27 to 10 with the intention of taking their first-round quarterback in Patrick Mahomes. And, well, as we all have seen, Patrick Mahomes has really started to take off in his way. And because of that, he is officially the best quarterback in the NFL to this point. 3 Super Bowls. I mean, what more can you say about the guy? The guy is just unbelievable. And I'm not going to put him in the conversation of greatest of all time yet, unless he wins another Super Bowl or, 2. If he wins 2 more, I think you might say he's the best of all time. But for the time being, I think he has an argument to be the second best quarterback ever, only behind Tom Brady, because Tom Brady's won 7 Super Bowls, and I think the more you win and the more MVPs you put up together, the more you have a legitimate argument. So that's my number 6. All right, now we're getting to the top 5, and the number 5 is really interesting because in 1974, the Pittsburgh Steelers hit 5 home runs in their NFL draft because they made a surprising draft when they selected not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 Hall of Famers, all in the same NFL draft. They chose Lynn Swann, the first pick in 1974, with their first pick in 1974. It wasn't the first overall pick because that went to Dallas that year. But with their first round selection, they took Lynn Swann, and they had to do it right in front of the Dallas Cowboys, who were set to take Lynn Swann, However, Chuck Noll was really more in love with another wide receiver, John Stallworth, who played at a historic black college and had some really good numbers there, but nobody had really heard of him outside of the Steelers scouts that they had at the time. But the Steelers were able to tell Chuck Noll, look, we got to draft Lynn Swann right now, because if we draft John Stallworth here, the Cowboys are going to pick up Lynn Swann, and we're going to regret this for the rest of our life. And sure enough, Chuck Noll agrees. The Steelers draft Lynn Swann with their first pick, and that was a huge reason why the Pittsburgh Steelers became the team of the 70s instead of the Dallas Cowboys, because Pittsburgh beat Dallas in 2 Super Bowls that year, or in that decade for that matter. It was a really remarkable achievement for the Pittsburgh Steelers to draft Swann in the first round. In the second round, they chose linebacker Jack Lambert, who was undersized and wasn't really viewed as a typical linebacker, but he was a guy that could go back, drop back in pressure, and also apply the pressure in the running game defensively. So that was a huge hit for them, getting a second-round pick in Jack Lambert, who also ended a Hall of Famer. The Steelers waited until the fourth round to pick John Stallworth, who turned out to be a Steelers clutch receiver during 1979 and also was a hero of Super Bowl 14, the fourth championship for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think John Stallworth remains the all-time leading receiver in Steelers history, although I'm not sure if Hines Ward has since gotten the record as well. But John Stallworth is regarded as one of the best Steelers of all time. And then in the fifth round, the Steelers selected Mike Webster, center for the team, who was arguably the best center in the history of the NFL. That's the position that snaps the ball, for that matter. A number of Pro Bowls, and Mike Webster was just a truly remarkable offensive lineman. But one more thing about that draft. Pittsburgh actually signed an undrafted free agent named Donnie Shell. And guess what, folks? Donnie Shell is in the Hall of Fame, so that means you have a perfect 5 for 5 in a Hall of Fame. That is something that is never going to happen in the history of the NFL, because teams have 7, 8 picks, depending on how many draft picks you got, and you are likely to have at least 3 or 4 players get in the Hall of Fame, whereas the others might not be as fortunate. But that's a huge win for the Steelers in '74, drafting arguably the best draft class in the history of the National Football League in the history of the league. So big job for the Pittsburgh Steelers right there. And at number 4, and this is a story that I found that was really interesting. It's when the head coach Bill Walsh was in his hotel room in Houston during the 1984 season, the night before the 49ers were scheduled to play the Houston Oilers. And Walsh is just bored. He's sitting there. He's just kind of minding his own business and everything. And you're thinking, okay, what's he going to do? So he finally decides to turn on the local news. And he watches the local news. They get to the sports section. And they show highlights of a game between, I want to say, Texas Southern against Mississippi Valley State. And there was a wide receiver for Mississippi Valley State that made a big impression on him. The guy who had the ability to catch the ball, who wasn't fast before the catch, but after the catch, he was blazing fast. Like, he was really fast afterwards. And Bill Walsh immediately was infatuated with the guy. He started making up plays for that player, and he was hoping that he could draft a wide receiver to keep the 49ers dynasty going. He trades up for that pick, and in '85, there were 3 wide receivers that were taken. Al Toon, Eddie Brown, and, of course, the player that the 49ers would wind up taking, although they were hoping to trade up to as close as 13, but they ended up trading up to 16, and they watched the first 2 receivers in Al Toon and Eddie Brown get drafted by the teams that they went to. But fortunately for the 49ers, they got the best one of the bunch, as Jerry Rice is widely regarded as the greatest wide receiver of all time. And that is a big accomplishment. Jerry Rice, the GOAT player, arguably in the history of the National Football League. You can't deny what that moment was like for Jerry Rice in particular. So that is a big win for the 49ers to take the best wide receiver in the history of the game. Now we go on to number 3, and I talked earlier about the New York Jets fans and how frustrated and angry they are about the possibility of getting the players that they wanted, but instead getting somebody else that they never heard about or didn't want, and then they boo the player and boo the pick. And you sometimes wonder, why do Jets players not get the opportunity to shut those Jets fans up and prove that they belonged in the NFL and show them something? Well, that was the case in 2011 when the Houston Texans decided that rather to take a dominant, well-known player that fans wanted, they instead took this defensive end from Wisconsin named J.J. Watt, who was coming off a great Rose Bowl performance, but for some reason, the Texans fans watching at the draft party, they booed the pick. They booed the guy, and you're like, why are you booing the guy? I mean, sure, I didn't know who J.J. Watt was, and I certainly, wouldn't have been impressed by the guy at first, but come on now, you got to give the guy a chance and everything. Sure enough, J.J., of course, took that very personally, and he went out there, and thanks to one interception in the first playoff game, he got the Texans back, or he made himself one of the Texans' best legends. The guy was a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year. He should have been the MVP in 2014. Sorry, Aaron Rodgers. I know that's going to hurt you, but I'll talk about you a little bit. But come on now. J.J. Watt getting drafted and getting booed by Texans fans, probably one of the biggest mistakes that the fan base can do. That's like John Stockton getting drafted by the Utah Jazz and being booed on draft day. He goes on to be the all-time NBA assist leader and lead the Jazz to the promised land along with Karl Malone. I mean, for real, that's just totally ridiculous and insane. But J.J. Watt, of course, got the last laugh, and of course, Houston Texans fans love J.J. Watt. It's unfortunate that we couldn't get him and the franchise a Super Bowl while he was there, and I really feel bad for the times. It felt like we wasted his career. I know he tried to win a Super Bowl in Arizona, but it just didn't quite work out. But J.J. did so much more for not just the franchise, but also for the city in Houston, especially after Hurricane Harvey, when he started a donation fund for that got a lot. And he and Jose Altuve were named Sports Illustrated Sportsperson People of the Year, or Sports People of the Year, for their contributions to the city in that significant time. But J.J. Watt, definitely a beloved athlete in the franchise, and for that, he is deserving of being on this list, because it just comes to show you that when you're an NFL player, you have the opportunity to shut people up. So, that's my number 3. Number 2, Aaron Rodgers, who could have been the number 1 pick in the National Football League, actually watched as Alex Smith was taken first overall, and then he sat for the next 22 picks in the green room, which takes a long time. A number of opportunities go by, and it became clear that Rodgers was going to slide. It was just a matter of for how long. And finally, pick number 24, he goes to Green Bay, where he has to back up Brett Favre. But the thing is, Aaron Rodgers, after getting past the 49ers with the first pick, there was really nowhere that he could have gone in the next 22 picks that I found out, because you had a number of teams that had a quarterback, but also had quarterbacks that were of high value in that situation. And so teams didn't have any cap space. And then, of course, there were a number of coaches that were on the hot seat and didn't want to take a chance on having a rookie quarterback. So Green Bay, of course, saw potential, and they didn't know how long Brett Favre was going to be in the NFL, so they finally said, all right, we're going to take Aaron Rodgers with our pick. And Aaron Rodgers, of course, got drafted at 24, and he's put together a hell of a career, leading the Packers to a Super Bowl, number 2-time MVP, and I mean, now he's on the Jets, or hopefully he should be on the Jets as a big productive player for them this season, although we just don't know for how long. And yeah, you could say all this stuff about the side of him that's kind of been showing lately, whether it's regards to politics and everything, but there's no denying that Aaron Rodgers is a tremendous quarterback, and certainly he got himself a case of humble pie, but he proved that he was the best quarterback taken in that NFL draft. And Alex Smith was okay, but he just didn't have that level of Aaron Rodgers. Alex Smith, of course, was taken overall, number 1 overall by the 49ers. And finally, number 1, I don't think you can deny it. Pick number 199 in the 6th round of the 2000 NFL Draft. I don't think you need to know the name of the person, but in case you do, Tom Brady having to wait 198 draft picks, despite playing for a very good program at Michigan, despite winning a national championship as a backup, despite leading the Wolverines to an Orange Bowl, Tom Brady had to wait for 6 rounds until pick number 199 for him to be drafted by the New England Patriots. It is the greatest draft steal in the history of the NFL when arguably the greatest dynasty in the NFL drafts the greatest quarterback in the history of the NFL. There is no question that Tom Brady deserved to be drafted or deserved to show everyone that it was a mistake to let 6 quarterbacks go by him before he was taken. And this is something that will never happen again. You will not see another quarterback, let alone another position player, put up these GOAT-like numbers that Tom Brady has done throughout his NFL career. And without question, Tom Brady continued to remind everyone why he was and is the GOAT when it comes to NFL quarterbacks. There's just no denying that Tom Brady is a man that deserves to be treated better. I mean, you look back at the 2000 NFL draft, and let's be real, he should have gone number 1. I mean, Cleveland had the number 1 pick, but they really should have drafted Tom Brady because I know he probably would have been at risk for a program or a franchise that wasn't really good at that time, but I think he could have been a great pick for the Browns. I also think he should have gone to the 49ers because that was his hometown team. He was at the 81 NFL championship game between the 49ers and the Cowboys when Joe Montana hit Dwight Clark for the catch, and he was there. He saw, at the time, the greatest quarterback in the history of the NFL, and little did anyone know that the greatest quarterback of all time was sitting in the stands of that game. So, figure that out. I mean, life comes full circle, but man, that's a huge mistake. All the 31 teams that didn't draft him, they're kicking themselves in the pants right now. The New England Patriots, best player for their franchise. Obviously, they've had to overcome a lot in their history. 6 championships, you cannot argue with Tom Brady. And then winning a 7th one with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That just shows you the greatness of Tom Brady. I mean, the guy's a different breed of quarterback and a different breed of football player. And who knows, he might still be interested in coming back to play in the NFL. So that is going to be my top 10 most iconic NFL draft moments that I have heard about in my time, or at least that I heard about in doing all this research stuff. And you know what, folks? It's really exciting to watch on Thursday. So I'm going to close the show out with our next segment when we come back. So stay tuned. All right, folks, we're going to close the show in just a moment, but before we do, something that had been brought to my attention while recording this podcast is something that I was totally intrigued by, this story of a high school baseball game that actually went on for a very long time, for that matter. But anyway, so I'm thinking back to my old high school days. I used to be the team statistician in my high school, Memorial High School, home of the Mustangs, and I want to say the longest baseball game I was ever a part of there was 11 innings, and that was a game that we ended up winning by the score of 6-3, albeit they play 7 innings of baseball in high school baseball in our state, unless they do something different in other states. But anyway, last night, as of this podcast, there was it started 2 nights ago. You have a baseball playoff series between Midland and Odessa, who were rivals inches apart, or feet apart, I should say. And they played a game that went 23 innings, and it took 25 and a half hours. Now, you might be saying to yourself, how is that possible? A 23-inning game in 25 and a half hours. I mean, that's ridiculous. But what happened was the first game, it was game 2 of the series, and Odessa had actually won the first game. So Midland needed to win the game 2 to force a deciding game 3. It was the best 2 out of 3. And so Odessa won the first game. Game 2 started at 4:30 p.m. on Friday, and this game was actually went into extra innings. And with the score of Midland High leading 3-2 in the top of the 14th inning, they suspended the game around 8:30 p.m. on Friday. So Midland was leading 3-2 in the 14th inning at 3-2 when the game was suspended. They resumed the game the next day at 3 p.m. and you're thinking to yourself, okay, if you're Midland, all you got to do is hang on for 3 outs and you win the game in 14 innings, and then you start the next game later on. Well, Odessa actually scored in the bottom of the 14th to tie the game back up at 3, and that would be the score that remained for the next 8 innings. Then Midland took the lead in the top of the 23rd, 4-3, and then they would hold on to win that game in 4-3 to force a deciding game 3. And in game number 3 of that series, Midland actually won the game 4-3, but it took 8 innings to complete. So, in essence, the teams played 31 innings in 2 days for this series, which is so crazy and so remarkable. But the 23 innings is actually the longest game in the history of Texas high school baseball. It actually came up short of the national record in the history of the United States, which was actually 25 inning games that took place in 1967 and 1975. But as far as the longest high school baseball game around the world, folks, you're not going to believe this. There was a 50-inning game in Japan back in 2014. And I'll tell you what, I'm so glad baseball has the pitch clock now. When I first heard that they were going to instrument it or include it in the upcoming season, I was a little skeptical because, you know, pitchers have a flow for the game, have a style that I was worried that it was going to mess up their rhythm, that was going to make the game more disastrous than it already was. But it actually has kind of worked out well. I give Major League Baseball a lot of props for that. And in fact, I give baseball a lot of props because now you're seeing it around in college stadiums. And I don't know if they were using a pitch clock in high school, so if y'all know about that, please feel free to comment on my YouTube channel about that. But I'll tell you what, folks, it's definitely exciting to see that take place. See a game like that, even though it can be a long time, whether or not you like baseball or not. But man, 23 innings. I don't know if I would have been able to live for that long in that situation. So, but huge shout out to both teams for playing in that epic 31 game series. And well, folks, that's going to do it for the third episode. Remember, this is on my YouTube channel at KRock1990. Kenneth Cline, Kenneth Wade Cline Jr. And I tell you what, I'm so excited to be doing this podcast. Hopefully, I have another one coming out real soon, and we should be talking about more things. But remember, the NFL Draft is this Thursday night, so be sure to watch it on ESPN or the NFL Network, whichever way you have. And also keep track and subscribe to my channel and subscribe to my podcast. And I will see you guys next time on this episode or this podcast of Crocking, Locking, and Dropping with the K-Rock. Have yourselves a good day, and we'll see you soon.